Nero is one name that instantly comes to mind when you think of ruthless emperors. He was one of the most ruthless and notorious rulers to ever walk the earth. When you hear the name, you think of a tyrant, madman, villain, and cruel ruler. He's the one we've all heard about, playing the fiddle while Rome burned, executing his own family, living a life of luxury and excess. But as the story goes, his reign didn't end with power or glory. So what really happened to Nero at the end of his life? Was it a sudden fall? A desperate act of suicide? Or was there something far more mysterious behind his death? Trust me, you won't believe how it all ended for this infamous emperor. Today we're going to uncover what truly happened in his final days and why the end of his story is still one of the most talked about mysteries in history. Before we dive into the gripping story of Emperor Nero's final days, make sure to hit that like button if you're fascinated by the untold side of one of history's most infamous figures. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and tap the notification bell because there's a lot more where this came from. So let's jump in. Nero's path to the throne wasn't one of pure destiny. It was a winding, violent journey that saw countless lives destroyed. Born in 37 AD, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was a figure of political intrigue from the very beginning. The great-grandson of Emperor Augustus, Nero was set to inherit the imperial crown, but not without a web of power plays, betrayals, and deadly ambitions between his family members. When Nero was just a young boy, the empire was already shifting. His stepfather, Emperor Claudius, was married to Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger, who had an unquenchable thirst for power. Agrippina made sure Nero was positioned to succeed the throne, even if it meant removing anyone who stood in her way, most notably Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. Agrippina's machinations didn't stop there. She even went so far as to poison her husband Claudius to ensure that Nero's reign would begin sooner rather than later. At the age of 16, Nero found himself unexpectedly crowned as Emperor of Rome, with his mother serving as his regent. In the early years of his rule, it appeared that Nero could be different. Under the guidance of his tutors, including the philosopher Seneca, he was expected to be a wise, moderate ruler. But as with many great promises, Nero's reign quickly veered off course. Over time, his initial promise as a young, somewhat thoughtful ruler gave way to an emperor driven by ego, excess, and an insatiable hunger for control. While Nero's first few years on the throne were marked by peace and relative stability, it didn't take long for cracks to appear. Nero's personal desires and egotism started taking the lead over any sense of duty. He began to surround himself with flatterers and yes-men, leaving the governance of the empire to the likes of Seneca and Burrus. But behind closed doors, Nero's real nature began to emerge, and with it came cruelty, paranoia, and a desire for absolute power. Soon, Nero began to act out in violent ways. His first major act of cruelty came when he had his mother, Agrippina, murdered in a brutal and highly publicized execution. This set the tone for the rest of his reign. No one, not even family, was safe from his unpredictable wrath. As Nero's reign continued, the cracks in his empire began to grow wider, and his power began to erode. What had once seemed like a promising rule was now descending into chaos. Nero's increasing cruelty, excessive spending, and paranoia were alienating key figures within the empire. Military leaders, political elites, and even the common people began to see Nero as what he truly was, a tyrant who cared more about his personal indulgence than the well-being of Rome. One of the first signs of trouble came in 59 AD, when Nero had his own mother, Agrippina, executed. This brutal act shocked the Roman Senate and its people, but it was just the beginning. Nero's hunger for power became insatiable. He had no respect for the traditions or values that had once held the empire together. His actions, ranging from extravagant building projects to lavish games and performances, drained Rome's coffers and angered the Roman elite. Nero seemed to care little for the empire's stability as he obsessed over his own image and pleasures. But it wasn't just the elites that began to turn against him. Soon, the military, a group of men who once held unwavering loyalty to the emperor, began to waver. By 68 AD, after years of financial mismanagement and political strife, Nero's once staunch supporters in the military started to rebel. It was in this moment of vulnerability that the revolt of Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul began to take shape. Vindex, a governor in the provinces, had grown disillusioned with Nero's reign. He declared himself emperor, and soon other military leaders in the empire followed suit. As the rebellion gained momentum, the Senate turned on Nero as well. With no support left from the military or the political elite, Nero found himself isolated. In a desperate attempt to retain power, he fled Rome, but his fate was sealed. The revolt, which began in the provinces, now had the backing of the Senate, which declared Nero a public enemy. His days as emperor were numbered. As Nero fled from Rome, his paranoia grew. He was no longer the emperor in charge of a vast empire. He was a hunted man, a former king now fleeing for his life. But what happened next was perhaps the most tragic and still debated part of his story. By the time Nero reached the final days of his life, his reign was hanging by a thread. The emperor, who once powerful and feared, now found himself isolated, his supporters turning against him one by one. The conspiracies that had long simmered under the surface were finally boiling over, and the walls were closing in. The Nero that had once been adored by the people and the Senate was now a broken man, hunted, betrayed, and consumed by his own paranoia. It's important to understand the political landscape Nero had created for himself. His cruelty, extravagant spending, and erratic behavior had made him deeply unpopular, especially among the elite. His reign had destroyed the confidence of the Senate, the military, and even the people of Rome. He no longer had any loyal allies, and by 68 AD, many key figures in the empire had already started conspiring against him. One of the most significant threats to Nero's rule came from a man named Gaius Julius Vindex, a governor in Gaul, who in 68 AD rebelled against Nero's oppressive policies. Vindex declared himself emperor, leading a revolt that quickly gained traction. While Vindex's rebellion was ultimately unsuccessful, it was a critical moment. It signaled to the military, the Senate, and the people of Rome that the emperor was no longer in control. The message was clear. The emperor was weak, and it was time for a change. As the revolt spread, more and more military leaders began to abandon Nero. The Praetorian Guard, the elite force once loyal to him, was now wavering in its support. Nero's army was no longer the formidable force it had once been. The revolt in Gaul and the defection of his own legions were just the beginning of a wave of betrayals that would leave Nero with no choice but to flee. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the Senate saw an opportunity to restore order. The senators, who had long been disillusioned with Nero's reign, declared him a public enemy.
They sought to distance themselves from the emperor, hoping to secure their own positions in the wake of his downfall. By this point, Nero had become a pariah, his reputation in ruins, and his very existence a threat to the stability of Rome. Nero's paranoia only deepened as he realized that the empire he once ruled was slipping through his fingers. With his former allies now his enemies, and his enemies growing in power, he retreated from Rome in desperation. His final days were a far cry from the extravagant indulgence that had marked his early reign. Now he was reduced to a fugitive, alone, and fearful of what would come next. In the end, Nero's downfall wasn't caused by a single enemy or a single event. It was a culmination of years of misrule, betrayal, and growing discontent. As Nero fled from Rome, it became clear that the final days of his reign were a direct result of the many conspiracies and revolts that had been building against him for years. The once mighty emperor, who had burned with ambition and power, was now running for his life, his empire on the brink of collapse. So how did Emperor Nero die? Nero died by suicide on June 9th, 68 AD, and here is how it happened. By the year 68 AD, Emperor Nero had made too many enemies. His reckless spending, cruel behavior, and failure to manage the empire had angered almost everyone. The final straw came when the powerful Roman legions in distant provinces rebelled. They decided to support another leader, a strict general named Galba, and declared him the new emperor. When news of this rebellion reached Rome, the Senate saw its chance to get rid of Nero. To protect themselves and gain favor with Galba, they took a drastic step. They officially declared Nero a public enemy of Rome. This meant he was no longer emperor. His sentence was to be captured and executed in a brutal ancient method, being whipped to death in public. Nero was in his palace when he heard the news. He was completely abandoned. His own personal bodyguards, the Praetorian Guard, had deserted him. Realizing he was utterly alone, and with soldiers coming to arrest him, he was seized by panic. Nero knew the soldiers were coming to capture him. He understood that if they found him, he would be executed in a brutal public display. He put on a dirty, old tunic as a disguise, and under the cover of darkness, fled the city with only 4 of his servants. They hid in a small, dusty villa about 4 miles outside of Rome, which belonged to one of his servants, a man named Phaon. There, Nero's situation felt hopeless. He learned that the Senate's soldiers were closing in on his location. He knew that if he was found, he would be dragged back to Rome and killed in a humiliating spectacle. Determined to control his own fate, Nero decided to die by suicide. He asked his servants to dig a grave for him right there. He then took out a dagger. But when it came time to act, he lost his nerve. He was too scared to plunge the knife into his own throat. He cried, calling himself a coward. Then, the sound that ended any hope arrived, the thunder of horses' hooves. The soldiers were at the door. In that final moment of desperation, Nero turned to his private secretary, a man named Epaphroditus. He begged him for help. He ordered Epaphroditus to kill him. What happened next is known as an assisted suicide. Epaphroditus, obeying his emperor's last command, took the dagger and stabbed Nero in the throat. As he lay dying, Nero is said to have uttered his famous last words, "What an artist the world loses in me." The soldiers burst in to find the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty already dead on the floor. He was 30 years old. His death marked the chaotic end of Rome's first imperial family. Nero's death, whether by suicide or murder, marked the end of an era for Rome. It left Rome in a state of confusion. The once great and powerful Julio-Claudian dynasty was no more, and the city was plunged into chaos and political instability. The emperor who had ruled with fear and extravagance was gone, but the damage he had done to the empire was not so easily undone. His passing marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and Rome faced a leadership vacuum that needed to be filled quickly. Immediately after Nero's death, Rome descended into instability because there was no immediate successor to replace Nero. The Senate, now rid of its most notorious ruler, declared an end to the Julio-Claudian dynasty, leaving the empire without a clear successor. Upon feeling pressure to restore political stability, the Senate declared Nero a public enemy, an official condemnation that stripped him of any legitimacy. Rome was left in disarray, and civil war seemed imminent. The empire needed a new leader, but with no clear heir, the power struggle that followed was intense. What followed was a power struggle that would lead to one of the most tumultuous periods in Roman history, the Year of the Four Emperors, in which 4 different men claimed the title of emperor in quick succession. These were Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. Each of them fought for control of Rome, and it took months of violent conflict before Vespasian ultimately emerged victorious, founding the Flavian dynasty. In the wake of Nero's death, several military commanders vied for control of the empire. The first to emerge was Galba, the governor of Spain, who was declared emperor by his soldiers. However, his reign was short-lived. Galba was soon overthrown due to his unpopularity and failure to win the support of the army. He was quickly overthrown and replaced by Otho, another military leader who seized power with the support of the army. These rapid changes in leadership left Rome in a state of constant unrest, and it wasn't until Vespasian, a general in the east, eventually took the throne that the empire found some stability once again. This chaotic period of civil war was not just the result of Nero's death, but it was also a reflection of the deep divisions that had formed within the empire under his rule. Nero had alienated key figures in the Senate and military, and his disastrous handling of the empire's finances and resources had set the stage for a collapse in Roman governance. What followed his death was not just a battle for the throne, but a battle for the very soul of Rome. Nero's death shattered the political stability of Rome. With no direct successor, the empire was torn apart by competing factions and a struggle for power. Nero's reign, marked by decadence and cruelty, had already alienated many of the Roman elite. As soon as he died, many felt that the empire was better off without him, yet they were unsure who should rule next. Nero's death also left a lasting impact on the way the Roman people viewed their emperors. His tyrannical reign had shattered any remaining faith in the imperial system. Future emperors would be forced to reckon with the legacy of Nero's cruelty, extravagance, and excess. Even as the empire stabilized under Vespasian, the memory of Nero's reign would remain, a reminder of the dangers of absolute power unchecked by morality or wisdom. Despite his infamous legacy, Nero's death also marked a turning point for Rome in another way. With the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the door was opened for a new line of emperors and a shift in the way Rome would be governed. The era of dynastic rule came to an end, and while the empire would never fully recover from the damage done during Nero's reign, it would eventually find a new path forward. Nero's death, as dramatic and mysterious as it was, didn't just mark the end of an emperor. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in Roman history, one defined by political intrigue, military power, and the constant struggle for control of an empire that, in the wake of Nero's rule, was forever changed.
Nero's death, however it truly unfolded, remains one of the most dramatic and mysterious chapters in Roman history. His reign was marked by excess, cruelty, and a growing detachment from the realities of the empire. In the end, his tyranny and paranoia led to a downfall that no amount of power could prevent. Whether by suicide, murder, or an elaborate escape, Nero's demise was the tragic end of a ruler who once held the world in his hands, but left nothing but chaos in his wake. While his death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, The chaos that followed only further solidified Nero's legacy as one of the most infamous emperors Rome had ever known. His reign and his death left a profound impact on the empire, reshaping Roman politics and governance for years to come. But Nero's story isn't just one of power and destruction. It's a reminder of the fragility of absolute rule. Even the mightiest emperors, when consumed by their own vices and surrounded by enemies, can fall. Nero's reign ended in darkness, but it also opened the door for a new chapter in Roman history, one that would be shaped by the aftermath of his rule. If you found Nero's story as captivating as I did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more deep dives into the most fascinating and mysterious figures in history. Your support helps us keep creating content like this, so don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. And if you want to help the channel grow and continue exploring the most compelling historical moments, consider supporting us through our Buy Me a Coffee link in the description below. Your support goes a long way in bringing more of these stories to life. Lastly, if you want to keep exploring more about the rise and fall of empires, the lives of other notorious rulers, and some of the most shocking moments in history, check out the videos on the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.